In 1961, South Korea's income per person was $72 a year, not per month, per year. North Korea's was higher. The New York Times had just published an editorial calling South Korea's economic prospects, and I quote, not promising. The country had no natural resources, no industrial base, and no obvious path forward. It had just finished a war that killed millions and left its cities in ruins. And then, in one of the most unlikely transformations in the history of the global economy, South Korea did something nobody had ever done at that speed. It built itself from scratch. Today, South Korea is the world's 12th largest economy with a GDP per capita of $37,000. Samsung and SK Hynix together control over 60% of the global market for the chips that power every AI system on the planet. In Q1 2026, semiconductor exports from South Korea surged 151% year on year. The country that had no path forward in 1961 now controls a critical piece of the infrastructure of the future. In this video, we are going to answer one question: how, and more importantly, can any country copy it? To understand the miracle, you have to understand what Korea looked like at the starting line. The Korean War, which ended in an armistice in 1953, had devastated the peninsula. Virtually every major city had been bombed, including Seoul, which changed hands 4 times during the conflict. Industrial output had collapsed, infrastructure was gone, and the division of the peninsula created an economic paradox that almost nobody remembers today. Before 1960, North Korea was the more industrialized half of the peninsula by a significant margin. Japan, during its colonial occupation, had concentrated its heavy industry, hydroelectric dams, chemical plants, and steel works above the 38th parallel in what became North Korea. South Korea got the agriculture, the poverty, and the ruins. In the 1950s, the United States provided South Korea with more foreign aid per capita than almost any country on earth. By some estimates, American aid accounted for over 50% of the South Korean government's entire budget. The economy survived on imports, not production. Exports were essentially zero. The country was, in economic terms, a ward of Washington, and the political situation matched the economic one: unstable, authoritarian, and dependent. There was no obvious reason to expect anything different. On May 16th, 1961, General Park Chung-hee led a military coup that overthrew the government. He was 43 years old. He had served as a junior officer in the Imperial Japanese Army during the occupation and had absorbed, by his own account, a deep admiration for the Meiji Restoration's model of state-directed industrialization. When he took power, Korea's per capita income was $72. North Korea's was higher. His opening speech contained a phrase he would return to repeatedly: the country had to escape poverty. What followed was one of the most deliberate, aggressive, and, depending on who you ask, morally complicated economic transformations in history. Park's government launched a series of 5-year economic development plans that directed the entire country toward a single goal: export-led industrialization. This was not a market economy in the Western sense. The government picked winners, directed credit toward favored industries, kept wages artificially low to maximize export competitiveness, and built infrastructure at a breakneck pace: roads, ports, electricity, everything the economy would need. The strategy was explicit: build capacity first, let living standards follow. It was brutal in the short term. It worked extraordinarily well in the long term. The engine of this strategy was the chaebol, massive family-owned conglomerates that the government selected, financed, and protected in exchange for meeting export targets. Samsung, Hyundai, LG, SK, and Lotte emerged from this system in the 1960s and 1970s. The government gave them preferential low-interest loans, shielded them from foreign competition, and set clear expectations: grow, export, or lose your privileges. The chaebols delivered. Between 1960 and 1999, South Korea's GDP per capita grew almost ninefold, the third highest growth rate of any country in that period. The 4 largest chaebols today produce over 40% of South Korea's entire GDP. The top 10 account for 80% of total industrial output. But the chaebol model alone does not explain the miracle. The second pillar was education. Park's government invested heavily in universal primary and secondary education from the early 1960s. By the 1980s, South Korea had literacy rates approaching 100%. By the 1990s, it had one of the highest rates of university enrollment in the world. This created a feedback loop. Educated workers enabled the chaebols to move up the value chain from cheap textiles and wigs in the 1960s to steel and shipbuilding in the 1970s to electronics in the 1980s to semiconductors in the 1990s. Each decade, the same companies pivoted into more sophisticated, higher margin industries, precisely because the workforce could handle the upgrade. In 1997, the model that had worked for 30 years nearly destroyed itself. The Asian financial crisis swept through the region, and South Korea was hit harder than almost anyone. The won collapsed, losing nearly half its value against the dollar in weeks. The country's foreign reserves were essentially depleted. The government had to go to the IMF for a $57 billion bailout, the largest in IMF history at the time. Unemployment tripled. Daewoo, one of the largest chaebols, collapsed entirely. Hundreds of companies went bankrupt. A generation of Koreans called this moment the IMF crisis, and they still do. What South Korea did next is what separates it from every other country that went through a similar crisis. Instead of protecting the failed system, it restructured it. Chaebols were forced to sell off non-core businesses. Banking regulations were overhauled. Labor markets were made more flexible. Foreign direct investment was actively welcomed for the first time. South Korea signed 16 free trade agreements covering 58 countries, representing over three-quarters of global GDP, including agreements with both the United States and China. Within 2 years, South Korea had repaid the IMF loan early and was growing again. The crisis became a catalyst rather than a conclusion. Now, let me push back on the triumphalist narrative because it deserves pushback. The miracle was real, but so were its costs. South Korean workers in the 1960s and 1970s labored for wages that were deliberately suppressed to maximize export competitiveness. Labor rights were crushed, democracy was suspended, political opponents were imprisoned or worse. The poverty rate in the 1950s exceeded 40%, and while it fell dramatically to 15.6% by 2020, inequality has risen sharply in recent decades. And the chaebol system created a concentration of economic power that Korea is still grappling with today. The question is not whether the miracle happened, it did. The question is what it cost and who paid. Fast forward to 2026, and South Korea has completed perhaps the most remarkable pivot in its history. The country that made wigs in the 1960s now controls the most strategically valuable commodity in the global economy: high bandwidth memory chips. Every single NVIDIA GPU used in an AI data center in the world requires high bandwidth memory. South Korea's SK Hynix controls between 50 and 60% of that global market. In Q1 2026, semiconductor exports from South Korea surged 151% year on year. SK Hynix posted a 72% operating margin, the highest in the company's history, generating $31 billion in operating profit in a single quarter. Samsung added another $36 billion. Total goods exports hit $85.9 billion in April 2026, up 48% year on year. But here is the honest picture of South Korea in 2026. It is two economies running at the same time. The chip economy is booming beyond any historical precedent. The domestic economy is not. While semiconductor exports surged 151%, domestic consumption grew only 0.6% in Q1 2026. Construction contracted. Services remain flat. The Korean won is at its weakest level against the dollar since 1998, the year after the Asian financial crisis. Household debt stands at 104% of GDP, one of the highest ratios in the world. And the fertility rate, we will come back to this, has fallen to 0.72, the lowest of any country on earth. South Korea has the lowest fertility rate of any country ever recorded in modern history, 0.72 children per woman. The replacement rate, the number of children per woman needed to keep a population stable, is 2.1. Japan's fertility rate, which we spent an entire video discussing, is 1.2, and Japan is considered a demographic crisis. South Korea's is nearly half of Japan's. At this rate, South Korea's population of 51 million will fall to 24 million by 2100, less than half of today. The working age population is already shrinking. The pension system faces existential pressure, and this is not a problem you can solve with monetary policy, stimulus packages, or semiconductor exports. Demographics is the one variable that no central bank controls. The Korean model was explicitly studied and attempted by multiple countries. Taiwan followed a similar export-led, state-directed path and succeeded. Singapore took the same framework with even more state control and arguably produced the highest per capita income in Asia. China's economic transformation from the 1980s onward drew heavily from the Korean playbook. State-directed investment, export orientation protected domestic champions. Vietnam is currently attempting a version of the same model, with exports surging and foreign direct investment flooding in. The blueprint exists. The results vary enormously based on institutions, geography, and timing. But three elements of the Korean miracle are essentially irreproducible. First, timing. Korea industrialized when labor costs were low everywhere in Asia and when Western markets were open and growing. That window is narrower today. Second, the Cold War context. South Korea received extraordinary American support, financial, military, and political, precisely because it was on the front line of the confrontation with communism. That geopolitical subsidy is not available to most countries. Third, the cultural intensity around education and work that Park's government both exploited and amplified. South Korea today has some of the longest working hours of any OECD nation, a direct legacy of the development model and one that may be contributing to the fertility crisis. You cannot copy what came from a specific historical moment. For an investor watching South Korea in 2026, the picture is genuinely complex. The semiconductor boom is real and structural. AI infrastructure requires the kind of high bandwidth memory that only South Korea can produce at scale, and that demand is not going away. SK Hynix's 72% operating margin is the kind of number that changes how investors think about a company. At the same time, the one at its weakest since 1998, household debt at 104% of GDP, and a fertility rate of 0.72 are all real risks to long-term sustainability. South Korea is a country that has solved every problem it ever faced except the one it has right now. But here is what South Korea teaches every economy, regardless of size or stage of development. First, institutions and education compound over time. The investments Park made in schools in 1962 produced the engineers who designed the chips that powered the AI boom of 2026, 60 years of compounding. Second, the willingness to pivot is more valuable than the asset you start with. Korea had no natural resources. It pivoted from agriculture to textiles to steel to electronics to semiconductors. The country kept upgrading. Third, speed matters, but sustainability matters more. The Korean model produced the fastest growth in history and is now facing the fastest demographic decline in history. The same intensity that built the miracle may be its undoing. South Korea went from $72 per capita to $37,000 in 60 years, from war ruins to the company that supplies the chips powering every major AI system on Earth. From an economy that was literally kept alive by American foreign aid to the world's 12th largest by GDP and the 7th largest exporter of goods. The miracle on the Han River is real, and it teaches three things that no other case study teaches as clearly: that institutions compound over decades, that the willingness to pivot beats the resources you start with, and that the price of extraordinary growth can be paid in ways that don't show up in the GDP numbers until it is almost too late. The question South Korea is now facing is whether the same country that solved the problem of poverty can solve the problem it created in the process of doing so. No economy in history has ever recovered from a fertility rate of 0.72. No country has ever figured out how to reverse a demographic collapse of that speed and scale. South Korea has beaten the odds before. If it figures this one out, it will be the most important economic story of the next 50 years. If you want to understand the forces shaping your financial future, subscribe to Mainnet Codex. I will see you in the next one.